In this lecture, we'll be dealing with the economies of China and the Soviet Union. In the 20th century, both of these countries adopted communist political systems and command-based methods of organising economic activity. The economic historian Richard Pomfret has called this the great economic experiment of the 20th century. Of course, later in the 20th century, both China and the Soviet Union move away from communist socialist systems and towards more market-based methods of organising economic activity. So in some ways, the experience of these countries in the 20th century is best described as the two great economic experiments of the 20th century. Now, these economic experiments mattered for several reasons. First of all, both China and the Soviet Union are large countries in terms of population. So in this graph, I've got the share of the world's population from 1900 through to 2000. And you can see that China accounting for always at least 20% of the world's population at the start of the 20th century, a little bit more, and the Soviet Union between 5 to about 8 or 9% of the world's population. So putting these two countries together, they account for at least a quarter of the world's population during the 20th century. So whatever happened in these countries, there was a large proportion of the world's population who were being affected. So in terms of human well-being, on a global scale, what happened in China and the Soviet Union matters a lot. A second reason why this matters is to the extent that the type of method of organising economic activity that China and the Soviet Union chose mattered for the level of economic activity, and I'll argue in this lecture that it did matter, then changes to the methods of organising economic activity, the economic systems in these countries, potentially have large impacts, especially again given the large population of these countries, on the amount of economic power these countries have and therefore on geopolitics. So in this graph I've shown the share of world GDP of the US, the Soviet Union and China, and you can see that the United States, starting out in 1820, relatively small share of the world's GDP, but by 1950 accounting for more than a quarter of the world's GDP. Now, China, back in the early 19th century, accounts for over 30% of the world's GDP, but then that progressively declines to the point where by 1950 it accounts for only 5% of the world's GDP. Now, obviously, that's nothing to do with China having a communist political system, because that only happens around about 1950. There are other reasons, some of which we talked about earlier, for the Chinese decline. But what we do see is that certainly there was no big improvement in China's share of GDP while it had a communist system, command-based method of organising economic activity. But once it's moved away from that system towards a more market-based method of organising economic activity, we can see that its share of world GDP converges towards that of the US. So when we come to the present, China and the United States are almost even, having around about 15 to 20% of world GDP. So a second reason why economic systems matter is that they matter for the level of economic activity in these countries. And for example, China being a large country, that has a lot of effect on geopolitics, the economic system changing the level of economic activity in a large country like China. A third reason why the great experiments of the 20th century mattered was that, as we've talked about before, during especially the early and mid part of the 20th century, there was considerable debate about the best way of organising economic activity. So coming out of the Great Depression, in the aftermath of world wars, there was a lot of questioning about whether capitalist market-based economy was the best method of organising economic activity. And so, for example, the rise of the Soviet Union as a military power, superpower in the 1940s, 1950s, which was interpreted at the time as revealing a general success of its economy. Now it's understood not to have been the case, but certainly at the time that gave an impression or a perception that the Soviet economy was performing at a level at least as strongly and perhaps surpassing that of capitalist market-based economies. So added to the debate about which was the right economic system, and China and the Soviet Union having adopted command-based methods of organising economic activity influenced a range of other countries to head down that planning path. So there's several reasons why the experiment with communism and command-based economic activity in the Soviet Union and China matters for economics and politics during the 20th century. Here I might just include a definitional note. So throughout most of this lecture, I'll be talking about the economic unit called the Soviet Union, which is the political unit that existed between Russia and the other units in the Soviet Union for a large part of the 20th century. And so I'll refer to that unit sometimes, and I'll break it down a little bit towards the end of the lecture, but I'll mainly be referring to the Soviet Union, mainly because that was the relevant economic and political unit during most of the 20th century, also because it's the unit which we have data on most continuously during the 20th century, for example, in the Madison data series. Now, what I've been presenting here is data on aggregate aggregate GDP in these countries. It's also useful to get an introductory perspective on the measure that we use as a measure of living standards, GDP per capita. And so I've done that in the next couple of slides. So on the vertical axis is just GDP per capita of China and the Soviet Union. So the red line is the Soviet Union, the blue line is China, and I've marked on the graph roughly where communism begins in the Soviet Union, in China, when it ends in China, and when it ends in the Soviet Union. You can see a couple of things here. First of all, that in the early 20th century, the Soviet Union is a bit ahead of China in terms of level of well-being. That's because the Soviet Union had industrialized to a somewhat greater degree than China. You can see, if we look at the Soviet Union, that during the communist era, it's certainly not the case that communism and command-based economic activity is associated with complete stagnation in economic activity. That there was economic growth during the period when there was a command-based economy, interrupted, as you can see, by World War II. But it's important to recognise that there is some growth, but that growth certainly sort of in the 1960s and 1970s is slowing compared to what had happened in the 1930s. If we look at China as well, we can also see that there's a positive gradient to that line showing that there was some economic growth during the period of communist economic activity in China. If we then look at the period after the two economies move away from completely command-based planned economies to allow a greater role for markets, we see two quite different pictures. We see basically increasing GDP per capita at an accelerating rate in China without really any significant blips. In Russia, what we see in the immediate aftermath of communism ending, a huge downturn in GDP per capita. So highly disruptive sort of initial transition phase from the old economic system to the new economic system before a period of recovery commences in the mid to late 1990s. So two quite different experiences with new economic systems, and so that's certainly a theme we'll take up later in this lecture. The other perspective I've just provided here as well, okay, that was the growth in China and the Soviet Union relative to, in absolute terms, but how are they going relative to the United States? Well, this graph shows that, and you can see that, for example, if we start off with China, relatively constant against the US for a lot of the period in the 20th century, but then in the period after the new economic system, you get China's GDP per capita increasing relative to that of the US, from below 10% up to about 25%. The Soviet Union in the sort of first phase of communism, increases its position relative to the US. The same thing happens sort of after World War II through to about the 60s. Then in the 60s and 70s, sort of stagnation against the United States. Then after communism ends, a falling away and then a recovery. But still, you can see quite a distance between these countries to the performance of the economic leader, the United States. So that's an introduction to why understanding about these economies in the 20th century is important, and a little bit about their economic performance. I should have mentioned as well that the quote I've got at the bottom of this slide, that this economic growth that's occurred in China in the period after the move away from communism towards a more market-based economy that's increased China's GDP per capita against the US from below 10 to 25%. That's had massive implications for well-being in China. This quote here describes it as the largest episode of poverty alleviation in human history. So this increase in China's GDP per capita, so this is average, but what it's done is effectively it's lifted several hundred million Chinese from below, for example, a World Bank poverty line to above the World Bank poverty line. So the statistics kind of say, well, yeah, 5% to 25%, that sounds pretty good. But the human significance of that is several hundred million people in China lifted out of poverty in terms of the way the World Bank defines it, even though on average China still has some distance to go to catch up to, for example, average living standards in a country like the United States. In the rest of the lecture, I'll start off by giving a little bit of background about China and the Soviet Union, their economic performance in the period before they adopted communist command-based methods of organising economic activity. Then I'll talk about a couple of problems associated with this method of organising economic activity. First of all, what I've called the big push and the logic of famine, which is basically about the fact that during this period of communist command-based economic organisation, China and the Soviet Union both experienced major episodes of famine. Secondly, I'll talk about what are some of the shortcomings of the system of planned organisation of economic activity, command-based method of organising economic activity. And I'll finish up by talking about the two economies in the period once they shift away from communism towards command-based towards market-based economic activity. So first of all, China, and then the Soviet Union. In the next section of the lecture, I'll talk about the first of these sections, which is coming to communism, the lead up in these countries to adopting command-based method of organising economic activity.